The October wind cut through Martha Sullivan's thin shawl like a knife through butter. It carried the sharp promise of an early winter across the Wyoming plains. She pulled her two children closer, their small bodies, the only warmth she had known in 3 long days of walking. Little Emma, barely 6, clung to her mother's skirt, one hand holding a rag doll so worn it was more patches than fabric. Thomas, 8 years old but trying his best to be the man of the family, trudged beside her with his shoulders squared against the cold. Before them stretched the small frontier town of Willow Creek, Wyoming territory. It looked less like a place of hope and more like a scattering of tired buildings clinging to the earth. A general store, a saloon with a broken piano tune spilling out its doors, a church with a crooked steeple, and a few homes leaning under the weight of the wind. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the scent of baking bread made Martha's empty stomach twist painfully. "Mama, I'm hungry," Emma whispered. "I know, sweetheart." "Mama's going to find us something to eat soon." Quote. Martha forced a smile she didn't feel, tasting the lie on her tongue. The last of their food, a piece of stale bread, had been divided between the children yesterday morning. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. The boarding house was the first place she tried. A woman with a face as hard as old wood opened the door just enough to glare. "We don't take in strays," she said, already closing it. "Please, ma'am, I can work. I can clean, cook, do laundry." But the door slammed shut before Martha could finish. At the general store, Mr. Josiah Pike was polite, but no more helpful. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Sullivan," he said, glancing toward the children. "I've got my wife and daughters to help me here. Times are too hard for taking on more mouths. Maybe the church." "Thank you," Martha cut him off quickly. She'd heard enough of that in every town they'd passed. Churches like to pray for widows, not feed them. The saloon was out of the question. She wouldn't take her children into a place filled with whiskey and wandering hands. But as she hurried past, a woman in a red dress standing at the doorway caught her eye. Their gazes met for a brief second, and in that second, Martha saw pity and understanding before she looked away and walked on. The bakery smelled of heaven. Warm, yeasty air poured from the open door, and the sight of golden loaves nearly brought tears to Martha's eyes. She let the children press their noses against the window before summoning the courage to step inside. "Mr. Holbrook," she said softly to the flour-dusted man behind the counter, "I'm looking for work. I'm a fair hand at baking." He shook his head with genuine regret. "My nephew just came out from Ohio to help me, ma'am. Try the restaurant down the street." The restaurant was run by a pinched-faced woman who looked her up and down with disgust. "A woman traveling alone with children?" she sneered. "I run a respectable establishment." "I'm a widow," Martha said, her voice shaking. "I'm just trying to feed my children." "That's what they all say," the woman snapped. "Move along before I call the sheriff." Quote. By the time Martha reached the church, the sun was already sinking behind the mountains, turning the prairie gold and purple. Reverend Matthias Thornby listened to her story without warmth or pity. "The church helps those who help themselves, Mrs. Sullivan," he said in a dry voice. "A woman in your situation might find it difficult to maintain moral standards. Perhaps if you had a male relative to vouch for you." "I have no one," Martha whispered. "Then I shall pray for you," he said, already turning away. Outside, the sky burned orange, but Martha saw no beauty in it. "God provides for the sparrows," the Reverend had said. But she felt like one he'd forgotten. "Mama, what are we going to do?" Thomas asked, as the last light faded. Before she could answer, the saloon doors burst open. A group of cowboys stumbled into the street, spurs clinking, whiskey on their breath, eyes mean with drink. Well, one of them drawled, stepping closer. "What have we here?" A little lost dove and her chicks. Martha pulled her children behind her. "Please, we don't want any trouble." Quote. "Trouble?" Another man laughed. "We're just being friendly." He reached for her arm, and Emma began to cry. Thomas, trembling but brave, stepped in front of his mother. "You leave my mama alone?" The men roared with laughter. One ruffled the boy's hair, and Martha slapped his hand away. "Don't touch my son." The laughter stopped. The bearded man's eyes went dark. You need to learn some manners, lady. The circle around her tightened. The street that had been full of sound moments ago now seemed deserted. Even the piano in the saloon had gone quiet. Martha's heart pounded as the man reached for her again. Then, hoofbeats, slow, steady, coming closer. A lone rider appeared at the end of the street. He dismounted with easy grace, dust swirling around his boots, broad shoulders, worn leather chaps, a revolver at his hip. "Evening, boys," he said, voice calm and firm. "Seems like you've had enough fun for one night." "This ain't your business, stranger," growled the bearded man. "That's where you're wrong," the cowboy said, stepping forward. "Everything that happens in this town's my business when it involves folks who can't defend themselves." Something in his tone made the men shift uneasily. He moved like a man who knew danger and didn't fear it. "Jake McCriedi," the bearded man spat. "Should have guessed." "Bartlett," the cowboy replied evenly. "You and your boys best move along before I start caring less about talking." The standoff stretched tight as a gun barrel. Then one of the younger men tugged Bartlett's sleeve. "Come on, Bart, not with McCriedi." Bartlett glared at the cowboy but finally backed down. "You can't protect every stray, Jake." "Maybe not," Jake said, eyes still cold, "but I can protect this one." As the gang retreated, Martha pulled her children close, trembling with relief. When the last of the men disappeared into the saloon, the cowboy turned to her. His eyes were a soft green, touched with sadness. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Jake McCriedi. You folks all right?" "Yes," Martha whispered, though her voice trembled. "Thank you, Mr. McCriedi. We're fine." Quote. He looked at her, really looked at her torn dress, the children's hollow faces. "No offense, ma'am," he said quietly, "but you don't look fine." He paused, then added, "When's the last time those little ones ate?" Thomas lifted his chin. "We don't need charity. Mama's gonna find work." Jake gave him a small smile. "Pride's a good thing, son, but it don't fill empty bellies." Then, after a moment of thought, he said, "Happens. I could use some help out at my place. Honest work for honest pay." Martha hesitated. A single man offering work and shelter could mean danger of another kind. Jake saw the doubt in her eyes. "You'll have your own cabin," he said gently. "My word as a gentleman, you and your young'uns will be safe." Her stomach twisted, torn between pride and desperation. "Mama," Emma whispered, "I'm so cold." Martha looked at her children, then at the cowboy who'd stepped between them and the wolves. "All right," she said softly. "We'll come." Jake nodded once. "Good. Let's get you home before the night freezes over." Quote. As they rode out of town, the lamp in his cabin burned like a promise against the dark. The wagon creaked along the frozen trail, its wheels crunching through thin layers of frost. The stars stretched endless and sharp above them, and the only sounds were the steady clop of Jake's horse and Emma's quiet breathing against Martha's shoulder. Thomas fought to stay awake beside her, his small body trembling with exhaustion and stubborn pride. "Almost there," Jake said, his voice low and calm in the night air. "You'll see the cabin light soon." Martha glanced at the man driving the wagon. Even in the dim lantern glow, she could see he was built strong and steady, the kind of man shaped by hard land and harder years. But there was something gentle in the way he spoke, something that made her feel, against all reason, safe. "You left a lamp burning," she said softly. Jake gave a small nod. "Always do. Never know when someone might need to see a light waiting." The simple kindness of those words caught her off guard. For 3 days she'd seen only locked doors and turned backs. Now this stranger, this quiet cowboy, was offering her more than shelter. He was offering hope. When the wagon crested the last hill, the ranch came into view. A small log cabin stood at the base of the mountains, its chimney sending up a thin ribbon of smoke. Beside it sat a sturdy barn, and beyond that, a fenced corral. The place wasn't grand, but it looked like it had roots, solid and honest. Jake helped the children down first. "Mind the step, little lady," he said, lifting Emma gently into his arms before setting her on her feet. Then he turned to Martha. For a moment, their eyes met, his green and tired, hers dark, with caution and gratitude. He offered his hand, rough and warm from years of work. She hesitated only a second before taking it. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of cedar and old smoke. A fire already burned in the hearth, filling the room with golden light. The space was simple, but clean. Stone fireplace, rough-hewn table, shelves lined with jars and tins, and a single small bedroom beyond a wooden door. "It ain't much," Jake said quietly, removing his hat. "But it's home. You'll be safe here." "It's perfect," Martha said, and for the first time in weeks she meant it. He showed her where the supplies were kept. Salt pork, potatoes, coffee, flour. Then, with an awkward nod, he said, "Barn's got a good loft. I'll bunk there. You and the children can take the house." Martha blinked. "You'll sleep in the barn? But this is your home." Jake shrugged. "Been sleeping out there most nights anyway. House feels too empty since—" He stopped himself, eyes shadowed. "Since a while back." She didn't ask. Grief had a way of speaking without words. While Jake tended the horses, Martha worked to make the cabin feel alive again. She found a skillet, sliced the salt pork, and soon the smell of food filled the air. Thomas and Emma hovered near the fire, watching her every move. When Jake returned, stamping the mud from his boots, he stopped short at the sight, the warm room, the children at his table, Martha stirring supper like she belonged there. "Supper's almost ready," she said softly. He nodded, removing his gloves. "Smells good. Been a long while since anyone cooked in this kitchen." They ate in near silence, except for the children's small noises of joy. Martha noticed how Jake's eyes kept drifting to the smaller chair at the table, the one clearly made for a child. He barely touched his food. When she started to clear the dishes, he stood quickly, looking away. "She liked to help with dishes," he murmured. "My daughter, Amy, had to stand on a box to reach the basin." "I'm sorry," Martha said quietly. "Long time ago," he replied, but his voice cracked on the words. "Her and her mama both. Fever took 'em, buried up on the hill under the big pine." Martha said nothing more. She understood loss. She'd buried her husband 2 years ago, after a mine collapse, and lost a baby that same winter. Grief was a language she spoke fluently. That night, after Jake retreated to the barn, she tucked the children into the bed. The blanket was rough, but warm, and for once, their sleep was peaceful. Martha sat by the fire, listening to the wind against the windows. Through the glass, she saw a faint light from the barn loft. Jake's light. Somehow, knowing he was nearby made the dark less heavy. Morning came crisp and bright. Martha rose early, her muscles sore, but her spirit lighter. She gathered eggs from the henhouse and fried them with bacon and biscuits. When Jake stepped in, his surprise was plain. "You didn't have to." "I did," Martha said, smiling faintly. "You hired me to cook and keep house." "I aim to do both." He hesitated, then nodded, sitting down as the children crept shyly to the table. Thomas studied Jake with cautious admiration. Emma giggled when Jake pretended not to see her sneaking a second biscuit. For the first time, laughter returned to the cabin. After breakfast, Jake showed them around the ranch. 160 acres, he said, gesturing at the valley below. Cattle in the lower pasture, horses in the corral. Nothing fancy, but it's honest work. Martha looked out at the land, the mountains rising tall behind them, the creek glinting like silver in the sun. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Jake glanced at her, his expression softening. It's been a long time since anyone said that about this place. They spent the day working side by side, feeding chickens, hauling water, mending a broken fence rail. By evening, Martha's arms ached, but it was the good ache of purpose. The cabin no longer felt empty. It felt lived in. That night, as she tucked the children into bed, Thomas asked, "Mama, why does Mr. Jake sleep in the barn?" "Because he's kind," she said gently. "He wants us to be comfortable." Thomas frowned. "But it's cold out there. He should have his house back." Martha smoothed his hair. "Maybe he will in time." Later, when the house was quiet, she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside. The night was silver with moonlight, and from the barn came a faint glow. She climbed the ladder to the loft, her heart thudding with every step. Jake looked up from where he sat, mending a bridle by lantern light. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, surprised. "Something wrong?" "Yes," she said simply, gesturing to the haybed. "This, you sleeping out here while we're in your house, it's wrong." He set down the leather strap, his face unreadable. "You haven't driven me anywhere, ma'am. The house, it holds too many memories." "I understand that," Martha said softly, "but hiding from them won't make them go away. The children think you don't like them. Thomas asked why you never eat with us anymore." That made him flinch. "I don't mean to hurt them," he said quietly. "I know, but you are. We're not trying to replace your family, Jake. We couldn't, if we tried. But you brought us here. You wanted life in that house again, even if you don't admit it." For a moment, the only sound was the wind rattling the barn boards. Then Jake sighed, looking away. "It's harder than I thought, seeing kids at the table again, hearing laughter in those walls. Sometimes Emma tilts her head just like Amy used to. And he broke off, voice rough. "It's like losing her all over again." Martha stepped closer, her voice soft but steady. "Maybe it's not about losing, Jake. Maybe it's about remembering that love doesn't die, even when people do. You gave us a chance when no one else would. Let us give something back. Let us help you remember." He looked up at her then, eyes glinting in the lamplight. "You've got a way of saying things that stick, Mrs. Sullivan." "Then let this stick," she said with a faint smile. "Tomorrow's Sunday. I'm making pot roast. The children would be pleased if you joined us properly." He gave a small, unsure nod. "I'll think on it." "Good," she said, turning to leave. "It's a big table, Jake. It's time someone filled the empty chair." When she looked back from the door, he was still sitting there, head bowed, hands clasped. A man fighting ghosts. But for the first time, she thought he might just win. Sunday dawned clear and cold, sunlight glinting off the frost that silvered the fields. Martha rose before the children and started the fire. The cabin felt warmer than usual, though she couldn't say if it was from the hearth or the quiet hope stirring inside her. She made pot roast with carrots and potatoes, baked bread, and even managed a small apple pie from the dried fruit in the cellar. The smell filled every corner of the house, softening the edges of the loneliness that had lived there for so long. "Is Mr. Jake coming to eat with us?" Emma asked, arranging spoons on the table. "I don't know, sweetheart," Martha said, "but we'll set a place for him and hope." By noon, the roast was tender and the pie cooling on the sill. Just as Martha began to think he wouldn't come, there were boots on the porch. The door creaked open and Jake stepped in, freshly shaved, wearing a clean blue shirt that made his eyes look like Wyoming sky. "Smells good in here," he said awkwardly. Emma gasped and ran to him. "You came! I told Mama you would!" Quote. He smiled and ruffled her hair gently. "Wouldn't miss it, little lady." They sat at the table, and for a while the meal was quiet and careful. But soon the children's chatter filled the gaps. Thomas told stories about the barn cats, and Emma described each kitten as if naming royalty. Jake listened, smiled, and even laughed once. Really laughed. The sound startled him as much as it did Martha. Halfway through the meal, Thomas knocked over his cup of water. He froze, expecting anger. Jake just reached for a towel. "Accidents happen," he said easily. "My Amy used to knock over everything in sight. Talk with her hands more than her mouth." The name hung in the air like a prayer. Martha's heart tightened, but Jake didn't look away this time. He met her eyes, steady and open. "She was about your age, Emma," he said quietly. Had a laugh that could chase the storm clouds clean out of the sky. Emma's voice softened. "I'm sorry she died." Jake's smile was sad. "Thank you, sweetheart. But I think maybe she sent you to remind me how to laugh again." Something shifted in that room, a stillness that felt sacred. For the first time, the cabin didn't feel like a house divided by ghosts. It felt like a home learning to breathe again. After dinner, the children begged Jake to see their drawings and the barn kittens. He followed them outside, pretending great awe at their treasures. Martha watched from the porch, her heart full. The way he bent to listen to Thomas, the way he smiled at Emma's nonsense. It was as if the man who had buried his family was slowly finding his way back to the living. That night, when the children were asleep, Jake lingered by the door. "Dinner was mighty fine, Mrs. Sullivan," he said quietly. "Thank you," she replied. He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "I was thinking, winter's coming on fast. That barn loft gets awful cold. I figure it's time I moved back into the house. There's the lean-to off the kitchen, plenty private." "That sounds sensible," Martha said, hiding her smile. "The children will be glad to have you close." He nodded, eyes softening. "Just for the winter," he added, though they both knew it wasn't just that. That night, the ranch was still under the moon, but in the warmth of the cabin, something new had begun to take root. 3 days later, trouble came riding back. Martha was kneading dough when Thomas shouted from the window, "Mama, someone's coming." A lone rider appeared through the dust, tall, sharp-featured, dressed in black. Even from a distance, the sight of him turned Martha's blood to ice. "Go to the bedroom," she whispered to the children. "Now." When the knock came, it was polite, too polite. She opened the door to face Hiram Thorne, her late husband's brother. "Well, hello, Martha," he said with a smile that never reached his eyes. "You're looking well. Widowhood seems to agree with you." "What do you want?" she asked. "My due," he replied. "Your husband owed me $3,000, and since he's gone, that debt falls to you and your young ones." "You're lying," Martha said, voice shaking. "He owed you nothing but decency, and you never gave him that." Hiram's smile widened. "I have papers signed by Samuel himself. And if you can't pay, well, there are places in San Francisco that pay well for children, pretty little girls especially." Martha's hand flew toward the rifle over the mantel, but Hiram grabbed her wrist hard. "Careful, Martha," he hissed. "Wouldn't want the children to see their mother make a foolish move?" Then, hoofbeats again. Jake McCriedi appeared like salvation through dust and sunlight, his voice calm but deadly. "Morning, Thorne. You've got about 5 seconds to take your hands off that woman." Hiram released her slowly. "You must be the cowboy," he sneered. "This is family business." "Family business don't include bruises," Jake said, stepping closer. "And this family's under my protection." Thorne's eyes flickered. He'd heard the name Jake McCriedi before, a man who didn't bluff. They stood in silence, the wind whispering between them. Finally, Thorne backed away, eyes glittering. "This isn't over," he spat. "You can't protect her forever." "Maybe not forever," Jake said, "but long enough." When Thorne rode off, Martha's knees gave out. Jake caught her before she fell. "You're safe now," he said softly. Tears slipped down her cheeks. "You shouldn't have to fight my battles, Jake." He looked at her then, steady and sure. "There are battles now, Martha. You and those kids are mine to protect, and that's a promise." Days passed, but the tension hung heavy. Then one night, a storm rolled in from the mountains. Rain lashed the windows. Thunder shook the earth, and the wind howled like wild ghosts. Jake had gone to check the cattle and came back soaked to the bone. Martha helped him peel off his wet coat, hands trembling more from worry than cold. "Bad storm," he said. "Worse than I've seen in years." The fire crackled, throwing light over the room. Outside, the world roared. Inside, it was only them. Two hearts that had carried too much. The children slept in the bedroom, safe and warm. Jake sat by the hearth, rubbing his hands together. "You should get some rest," he said. "I will," Martha murmured, but she didn't move. The storm outside felt too wild to face alone. Lightning split the sky, and Emma cried out from the other room. Martha rose, but Jake stopped her gently. "I've got her," he said, disappearing into the bedroom. When he came back, his shirt was damp, where Emma's tears had soaked it. "She's fine now," said she dreamt of thunder stealing her doll. "Thank you," Martha said softly. Jake sat back down near her. The storm raged on, but between them, there was calm. After a long silence, he said quietly, "Do you remember what you said that first night, that you'd sleep in the barn?" Martha smiled faintly. "I didn't want to presume on your kindness." He leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "You said you'd sleep in the barn, and I should have told you right then. You'll sleep safe here with me watching over you, you and those little ones." Her breath caught. The firelight flickered between them, painting his face in gold and shadow. "Jake," she whispered, not sure what to say. He reached across the small space and took her hand. His touch was warm, calloused, and sure. "You don't have to face this world alone anymore, Martha. You'll sleep safe. On me. Beside me. Under my roof. And under my protection." "That's my word." The storm began to ease outside, the wind fading to a sigh. Inside, the silence felt full, of promise, of peace. Martha squeezed his hand, eyes shining. "No more barns, then," she said softly. "No more barns?" Jake agreed. Weeks later, when the snow lay thick over the valley, Hiram Thorne returned for the last time. He brought a crooked judge and forged papers, but this time Martha had proof, Samuel's real will, hidden for months inside Emma's doll. The ranch hands and townsfolk stood with Jake and Martha when the truth came out. Hiram's lies shattered, his power vanished, and he left town in disgrace. After that day, the ranch changed, the fear lifted. Laughter came back for good. And one snowy afternoon in December, Jake McCriedi asked Martha to marry him in the very barn where he'd once slept alone. "I thought this place could never be home again," he said, voice breaking. "But then you came, and it was." Martha smiled through her tears. "I'll sleep in the barn," she teased. He pulled her close, eyes shining. "You'll sleep on me?" he whispered, just before kissing her. And that night, in the warm light of the cabin, with their children safe and laughter echoing through the walls, she finally did. Safe. Loved. Home, at last.